Imagine opening a book, expecting, I don't know, maybe a mild warning or some gradual buildup.
Right, like a little sign of a storm on the horizon.
Yeah, exactly. You know how prophetic texts usually work? There's a conditional, change your ways or else kind of message. But
Mhm.
then you crack open the book of Zephaniah from the Hebrew Bible, and the very first sentence is God promising to completely just reverse the Genesis creation story.
It's intense. He essentially says he's going to wipe out humans, beasts, birds, and fish.
Yeah, there is no buildup. It's just instant cosmic uncreation.
It is the absolute definition of starting at the climax, honestly.
Right. Which brings us to our topic today. Welcome to today's deep dive. I'm your host, and today we're exploring a really fascinating ancient three-chapter text that takes us on, one of the most intense journeys in all of ancient literature.
And I'm so glad to be here to unpack it with you. The mission today is to really dig into Zephaniah's core moral warnings, his major prophetic themes, and how the text executes this massive structural shift from total, unyielding darkness to just explosive hope.
Yeah, it really is a wild ride. But to truly grasp the whiplash of this text, we kind of have to look at it as a carefully constructed three-act play. And before we get to the end of the world in Act 1, we actually need to establish the very specific, very human context behind it.
Exactly. Because despite that cosmic opening, chapter 1, verse 1 grounds us in a very real historical moment. It places us firmly in the days of Josiah, the son of Amon, king of Judah.
Right, and you probably know Josiah as the great reformer king,
Yeah.
the boy king who grew up to initiate these massive religious reforms.
Tearing down idols, trying to pull the nation back to the worship of Yahweh.
Yeah, so on the surface, things supposedly looked pretty good, or, well, at least like they were moving in the right direction. But what's fascinating here is Zephaniah flashing his own credentials in the very first verse.
This is a great detail. He traces his lineage back 4 generations. He says he's the son of Cushi, son of Gedaliah, son of Amariah, son of Hezekiah.
Which is super unusual, right?
Oh, highly unusual. Prophets usually just list their father, or maybe their grandfather if they really need to establish local roots.
Okay, so why go back 4 generations?
Well, tracing it back specifically to highlight Hezekiah, who is one of Judah's most prominent faithful kings, is essentially Zephaniah flashing an all-access pass. He is signaling his royal blood.
Wow, okay.
Yeah, he's not an outsider or some shepherd or a street preacher shouting at the city gates. He's a royal insider.
So he sees the reality behind the propaganda.
Exactly. He's seeing the political and spiritual rot that is happening behind closed doors, stuff completely invisible to the public who just see Josiah's surface-level reforms.
Man, that completely changes how you read it. Which brings us to Act 1, the universal collapse and the exposure of that hidden rot. The text starts with that threat of uncreation, wiping out the birds and the fish, but then it acts like a satellite, like aggressively zooming in.
It really does. It goes from a view of the whole earth right down to a specific neighborhood in Judah and Jerusalem.
And it targets their specific religious failures.
Right, it zooms in on the spiritual syncretism happening right in the capital. The text mentions cutting off the remnant of Baal, the idolatrous priests, and people worshiping the stars on their rooftops.
But the detail that is so revealing to me is when it targets those who swear loyalty to the Lord, but also swear by Malcolm.
Yes.
For a modern reader, it just sounds like a list of ancient names. But they're essentially hedging their bets, aren't they?
Precisely. They haven't necessarily stopped worshiping Yahweh. They've added other gods to the shelf because they want a diversified spiritual portfolio, so to speak.
A diversified portfolio. I love that.
Yeah. You know, Yahweh is the God of their ancestors, the God of the eternal covenant. But Malcolm was an Ammonite deity closely associated with state power, commerce, and wealth.
Ah, so they're basically saying, we'll pray to Yahweh for tradition in the afterlife, but we need Malcolm for a good harvest and political favor right now.
Exactly. It's spiritual and moral compromise entirely for the sake of comfort and security. And that desire for absolute, undisturbed comfort is the core disease Zephaniah is diagnosing here.
And that leads to one of the most vivid visual metaphors I think I've ever read in an ancient text. In chapter 1, verse 12, God says, I will search Jerusalem with lamps, and I will punish the men that are settled on their lees.
It's such a brilliant image.
The translation settled on their lees is a winemaking analogy, right? And it is just so deeply descriptive of what apathy actually does to a society.
It really is. In the ancient world, winemaking was a universal reference point. Everyone understood it.
Right. So when you make wine, the lees are the dead yeast cells, the sediment, basically all the particulate matter that naturally falls to the bottom of the barrel.
Right.
And a good winemaker has to rack the wine, meaning they have to agitate it, pour it from one vessel to another, just to separate the liquid from that dead sediment.
Because if you don't,
Exactly. If you leave the wine sitting on those lees for too long without disturbing it, it doesn't just get stagnant. It fundamentally absorbs the bitter, foul flavors of that dead sediment. It ruins the wine from the inside out.
and look at how perfectly that mechanism applies to the society Zephaniah is observing.
Yeah.
The people he is targeting. They aren't out in the streets committing violent crimes. They aren't leading armed rebellions. They are simply untouched.
Wow.
They haven't been challenged or agitated or poured out in so long that they are literally absorbing the rot of their own comfort.
They are absorbing the bitterness of their own inaction.
Yes.
And the text even tells us the psychological result of sitting on your lees too long. It says, these people think in their hearts, the Lord will not do good, neither will he do evil.
They have become practical atheists.
Right. It's not that they deny God exists. They just think the universe is entirely empty of consequence.
Which is the ultimate form of arrogance, really, just masquerading as apathy. They believe their comfort is a permanent law of nature. And that's exactly why the metaphor of the lamp is introduced.
Oh, because they're hiding in the dark.
Exactly. God isn't bringing an army in this specific verse. He is bringing an unyielding, searching light. He has to take a lamp to search them out because they are hiding in the dark, quiet corners of their wealth and indifference.
And when that lamp exposes them, the tone of the text shifts into something honestly terrifying. You see this heavily repeated Hebrew vocabulary anchor the rest of the chapter.
Right, the use of the word yom.
Yet yom meaning day, over and over. But it's not a celebration. It's called the great day of the Lord, a day of wrath, trouble, distress, wasteness, darkness, and thick clouds.
It's incredibly bleak.
And then in verse 16, it hits this crescendo, yom shofar.
The day of the horn and alarm. And it's crucial to understand that the shofar, the ram's horn, in this context, it wasn't a musical instrument meant to gather people for a nice festival.
Right.
It was an ancient air raid siren. It was the visceral, panic-inducing sound of an incoming military attack breaching the city walls.
Wow.
Zephaniah is constructing a deliberately heavy, dark, and sensory foundation here. He's saying that this quiet apathy, this comfortable complacency sitting in the dark, is going to be violently shattered by the light of the lamps and the deafening sound of the alarm.
So the lamp exposes this quiet apathy at home. But, apathy doesn't exist in a vacuum. It eventually scales up.
It always does.
What starts as quiet indifference in a neighborhood scales into something much louder, much more destructive, and far more arrogant on a national and global level. Which brings us to Act 2, Chapter 2.
The camera pulls back.
Yeah, it pans outward to the surrounding superpowers. But before it tears them down, it offers a single, crucial life raft. It opens with a plea to the shameless nation to gather themselves before the fierce anger comes. And verse 3 says, "Seek ye the Lord, all ye humble of the earth, seek righteousness, seek humility."
That is the pivot point of the entire book. Oh, absolutely. Zephaniah is establishing the central conflict here. It is human arrogance against the necessity of humility. The text is making it clear that the only shelter from a systemic collapse of the moral order isn't wealth, and it isn't political alliances. It's humility.
But of course, the empires of the world aren't exactly known for their humility. So to prove that this standard of judgment applies universally, Zephaniah takes us on a geographical tour of doom.
But it's not just a random list of cities, which is fascinating.
No, it's highly structured. He creates a massive compass rose.
Exactly. He starts by targeting the Philistine seacoast cities to the west, like Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, saying they'll become empty pastures for shepherds.
Right.
Then he swings entirely across the map to the east, targeting Moab and Ammon, declaring they will be a desolate wasteland like Sodom and Gomorrah. Then he looks south, down to the Ethiopians, saying they'll fall by the sword. And finally he looks north, targeting the massive superpower of the day, Assyria, and its legendary capital, Nineveh.
West, east, south, north. He is literally drawing a giant crosshair over the known world.
He really is.
And we'll get to the center of that crosshair in a moment, but I want to stop at Nineveh because the text gives us this fascinating psychological insight into how an empire actually falls.
Yes, the description in verse 15.
Right. It describes Nineveh as joyous and dwelling carelessly, and it records what the city says in its heart. I am, and there is none else beside me.
That specific phrase, I am and there is none else, is historically and linguistically reserved exclusively for the divine in the Hebrew Bible.
Wow.
It is the language of Yahweh. For a human city, a political entity, to claim that language for itself is the absolute pinnacle of hubris.
It's the ultimate scaling up of the people sitting on their lees. The individuals thought God won't do anything. The empire thinks we are God.
Precisely.
If I'm tracking with Zephaniah's argument here, he's showing us the mechanism of collapse. Unchecked pride believing you are the center of the universe and entirely untouchable. It blinds a society to its own fragility.
Exactly. When a society believes it's godlike, it stops correcting its own flaws. It stops caring for the vulnerable. It stops maintaining the foundations of justice. It just rots from the inside out until the structure gives way.
And the text paints such a haunting picture of the aftermath. This once bustling metropolis becomes a ruin where, like, pelicans and wild beasts lodge in the broken pillars and travelers just walk by and hiss at the destruction.
It's total devastation.
So we have the compass rose drawn. The west, east, south, and north have been dismantled by their own arrogance, which means the crosshair has to land on the center.
And that brings us to Act 3, Chapter 3.
The focus swings painfully back home to Jerusalem. We saw their quiet apathy in Chapter 1, but now we see the active rot of their institutions. The critique is just brutal. It calls Jerusalem the oppressing city.
Because the leadership has become entirely predatory. The text says the civic leaders, the princes, are roaring lions. The judges are wolves of the desert that devour everything and don't even leave a bone for the morning.
And the spiritual leaders are completely compromised. The prophets are treacherous. The priests profane holy things and do violence to the law.
They're supposed to be the moral compass, but they've sold out.
Right. And verse 2 really acts as the indictment. She received not correction. She trusted not in the Lord. They were offered that life raft of humility back in chapter 2, and they threw it back.
Because arrogance cannot accept correction.
So true.
And this total rejection of humility leads to the absolute climax of the judgment in verse 8. God declares his determination to gather the nations, assemble the kingdoms, and pour out his indignation. He says, all the earth shall be devoured with the fire of my jealousy.
Okay, wait, I have major structural whiplash here. Let me stop you because I read verse 8 and it sounds like the final fatal blow. Total global annihilation by fire.
It does sound like that.
But then literally in the very next breath, verse 9 pivots completely. It says, for then will I turn to the peoples a pure language, that they may all call upon the name of the Lord to serve him with one consent. How do we get from total annihilation to universal harmony in a single sentence? Did Zephaniah just change his mind? Or is there a mechanism here I'm missing?
It is the most profound pivot in the text.
Yeah.
And it hinges entirely on how you understand the concept of biblical judgment. Zephaniah hasn't changed his mind at all. The fire in verse 8 and the pure language in verse 9 are inextricably linked.
How so?
The fire is not a weapon of annihilation. It is a crucible.
Ah, a refining fire.
Exactly. Think back to the winemaking analogy.
Right, the lees.
The society is thick with the bitter sediment of arrogance, apathy, and predation. The fire of jealousy isn't meant to vaporize the barrel. It's meant to burn away the dross.
Oh, wow.
The judgment and the salvation are actually the exact same event, just experienced differently depending on what you're made of. The fire consumes the roaring lions, the evening wolves, the corrupt priests, and the empires that say, I am and there is none else. It acts as a purifier.
Oh, that completely recontextualizes the whole book. And the text actually confirms this structural intent in verses 11 and 12. It says, God will take away the proudly exulting ones out of the holy mountain. The arrogants are basically skimmed off the top.
Yes. And what is left in the crucible after the fire has done its work? The text says, I will leave in the midst of thee an afflicted and poor people, and they shall take refuge in the name of the Lord.
So the remnant that remains will not do iniquity or speak lies.
Exactly. The impurities have been burned away. What remains is a humble people with a pure language.
That's incredible.
The syncretism, the swearing by Yahweh and Malcolm is gone. Their allegiance, their language is singular and pure.
The crucible mechanism makes the ending so much more powerful because it doesn't just end with like relief that the fire is over. It ends with this joyous, explosive finale that literally sings.
Oh, it is.
Verse 14 says, "Sing, O daughter of Zion, shout, O Israel, be glad and rejoice with all the heart." The contrast is staggering.
It's night and day.
Think about where we started. Chapter 1 was the Yom Shofar, the terrifying air raid siren, the thick clouds, the heavy, suffocating darkness of a universe unraveling. And now, that dread is entirely replaced by radiant light and music.
It is a total reversal.
Yeah.
God is no longer walking around the dark corners with lamps, searching out the apathetic to expose and punish them.
Right.
Instead, verse 17 paints this breathtaking image. The Lord is in the midst of thee, a mighty one who will save, and he will actively rejoice over the people with singing. The divine warrior of chapter 1 has become the singing savior of chapter 3.
God singing over his restored people. It's incredibly beautiful. And the text concludes by saying, God will gather those who are driven away, the vulnerable who are preyed upon by the lions and wolves, and he will turn their shame into praise among all the nations of the earth.
The restoration, the healing, is just as universal as the initial threat of uncreation was.
The scope of the book is truly masterful. Zephaniah takes the reader through the most terrifying depths of systemic collapse, forces them to look at their own internal rot, tears down the greatest empires of the ancient world, and then reveals that the entire agonizing process was, well, a surgery designed to save the patient.
Which is why it's such a brilliant piece of literature. The geography may be ancient, but the human condition he describes is incredibly modern.
Absolutely. When you step back and look at the whole arc of these 3 chapters, it's impossible not to turn that unyielding lamp on yourself.
Yeah, it really makes you think.
It takes us on an intense journey from universal doom through the painfully specific exposure of our hidden apathy across a map of arrogant empires and lands in a crucible of profound purification. It forces you to look in the mirror and ask, where am I settling on my own lees?
Right.
Where am I getting thick, bitter, and comfortable in my apathy, thinking my actions don't have consequences? Or on a larger scale, where am I puffed up with pride, acting like Nineveh, saying in my heart, I am and there is none else?
Those are the exact questions the text demands we ask.
So we'll leave you with a final thought to mull over as you go about your day. Think back one more time to that piercing, uncomfortable metaphor of the lamps in chapter 1.
It's a powerful image to sit with.
It really is. If someone were to take a bright, unyielding lamp and walk through the dark corners of our modern society, or even more specifically, the private, quiet corners of your own daily routines, your own financial decisions, your own spiritual compromises, what hidden apathy or comfortable complacency might that light expose?
That's a heavy question.
And based on the dramatic, crucible-like structure we just explored today, could allowing that light to expose your own darkness be the necessary, painful first step toward finding your own pure language and ultimate restoration?